Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bestra. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's Hammer Forum on the growing YIMBY movement. So we're joined today by YIMBY activist Sonja Trauss, housing advocate Robin Hughes, who's the president of Abode Communities, and UCLA architecture and urban planning professor Dana Cuff. I want to quickly mention a couple of other upcoming Hammer programs you might be interested in. On April 10th, we have a Hammer Forum on the Mueller investigation. On April 17th, we're doing a forum on border and immigration policy with Univision anchor Leon Krautze. And on May 28th, we're doing a forum on the rise in nonprofit journalism. Also, next week, we have a series on the status of Black women in America called Her Dream Deferred, which is a collaboration with UCLA law professor Kimberly Crenshaw. Before we get started with the program, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and please note that photos, videotaping, and audio recording aren't allowed, but we are videotaping it, and we will make this available on our website tomorrow, so if you want to share it with people, you can. And on to tonight's program. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and our moderator today is Dana Cuff. You should have all received some note cards and pencils on your way in. Those are for you to write your questions on for the question and answer period. When we get closer to Q&A, we'll send around ushers to collect your cards and bring them up to the stage. If you didn't get a note card or you need some extras, you can just raise your hand and we'll send an usher to bring you more. Please be sure to write your questions very, very clearly so that the moderator can read them out loud for our guest speakers to address. So now I'm going to introduce our speakers and then we'll get started. Dana Cuff is a professor of architecture and urban design at UCLA, where she's also director of cityLAB, an award-winning think tank that advances experimental urbanism and architecture. Since receiving her PhD in architecture from Berkeley, she has published and lectured widely about spatial justice, the architecture profession, and affordable housing. She's the author of several books, including The Provisional City, about post-war housing in Los Angeles, and a co-authored book documenting her innovative cross-disciplinary project at UCLA called the Urban Humanities Initiative. Based on cityLAB's studies, she co-authored a landmark bill that permits backyard homes on virtually all 8 million single-family properties in California. That's Bill AB 2299, which passed in 2016, thereby doubling the density of suburbs across the state. She and her team are currently working on a wide range of new forms of affordable housing to be co-located with schools. Sonja Trauss is one of the founders of the YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement. In 2014, while she was working as a high school math teacher, she started organizing pro-housing renters to testify in favor of proposed housing developments at the Planning Commission in San Francisco, because the Bay Area is experiencing a housing shortage, and housing shortages are bad for renters. Currently, Sonja is co-executive director of a legal nonprofit that sues the suburbs to enforce state housing laws all over California. Their goal is to build more housing in opportunity-rich, high-demand areas in order to reduce displacement and promote economic integration. Robin Hughes is the president and chief executive officer of Abode Communities, a Los Angeles-based nonprofit architect, developer, manager, and operator of affordable housing with enhanced services. She's been actively involved in affordable housing and community development for over 30 years, and in her 23 years as leader of Abode Communities, she's transformed the organization into one of the top 50 affordable housing developers in the United States and the premier provider of environmentally sustainable affordable housing in California. Under her leadership, Abode Communities has developed more than 45 residential and mixed-use communities, created new affordable homes for over 8,500 California residents, and provided a social safety net through Beyond Homes, the organization's resident services program. Hughes is a leader in housing policy at the local, state, and federal level. She serves or has served on numerous boards, task forces, advisory bodies, etc., where she continues to advocate for resources, programs, and policies to support the production and preservation of affordable housing for low-income residents. So today we're going to get a brief explanation of NIMBYism and YIMBYism from Dana Cuff to bring everyone up to speed, and then we'll hear short presentations from Sonja Trauss and Robin Hughes, and then Dana will moderate a roundtable discussion followed by audience Q&A. So now please join me in welcoming Dana Cuff.
I was trapped behind the curtains. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm sorry that it's finals week and we don't have more students with us, but I also want to especially thank the Hammer for entertaining a controversial topic like the growing YIMBY movement, and especially to Claudia Bester, who was my partner in crime in trying to organize this panel. YIMBY for me was much more practical and literal than political and symbolic at the start. My husband and I actually built a backyard home and lived in it for 25 years, raised our children there. And so we had a yes in my backyard attitude, but it was only later that I began to realize, as Claudia mentioned, that this was really part of a housing solution that was happening all over Los Angeles, particularly in working class and low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color where illegal housing units were being built in the backyard in order to have a household economy that made sense, even though it didn't necessarily add value to the property that they built it on because of the fact that it was illegal. So when Jane Blumenfeld, who's here tonight, and I co-authored the state law, it was to try to get a legal secondary unit market started, and that's really had a huge effect. I think that we're in a new stage, however, with the backyards, or yes in my backyard, not in my backyard movement, and part of the indication of that is the protest and the activism of the people who are outside tonight, who I welcome and think represent a kind of third generation of the affordable housing movement. YIMBY, when it arose in 2014, primarily in the Bay Area, was standing against the NIMBY movement, the not in my backyard people. And the NIMBY activism really arose in the mid-1970s, primarily in the context of local opposition to then proposed nuclear power plants. You can imagine that people didn't really want those in their backyard. It was more about environmental justice. However, the rise of more and more powerful NIMBY groups started opposing all kinds of changes to their neighborhoods, not only trash dumps, but also forms of new housing. As a recent study concludes, and I quote, "It will require a deep cultural shift to disentangle the power of NIMBY obstructionists from the future needs of cities and communities." I think YIMBY is one such culture shift. It's probably the question we should be asking tonight is, why YIMBY now? And I think we're all pretty aware of the deep housing crisis that cities across the country, by some measures, Los Angeles has the least affordable housing in the state, if not the country. Some 50,000 fellow residents of Los Angeles are homeless, and California has built 80,000 new units of all forms of housing per year for the last decade, when it's estimated that we need 500,000 a year to meet the need. That's a huge gap and has caused housing prices to continually rise. Clearly, housing production and construction can't keep pace with demand, and that means that it's doubly true for affordable housing. Our panelist from Abode, Robin Hughes, knows more about nonprofit housing than practically anyone else in LA. Sprawl, LA's past solution to housing construction and affordability, is no longer an option, as we know, both for environmental reasons and because we've run out of land at the limits of where one can actually commute back and forth to work. Legislators, from the new governor to state senate and assembly members, are forwarding housing transit legislation that encourages higher density around public transportation, more affordable housing in the mix, and, importantly, no displacement of low-income residents as that's being done. Newsom, in fact, our new governor, proposed just this January to withhold state funds from cities that fail to meet housing production targets. And that's an indication that though maybe we all expect that densification of existing urban hubs where transit, walkability, and mixed use converge is an ideal site for new, more affordable and more housing, the question of where and for whom is always the bottom line question. And that really pulls us back into the discussion of spatial and social justice, that market rate housing has displaced existing neighborhoods of affordable housing, which has produced a new anti-gentrification activism, hence YIMBY, public housing in my backyard, and the individuals with the signs in front of the Hammer tonight. Really, I think one of our questions is how to balance the interests of current residents with those in need of housing, and how to stimulate the production of the right kind of housing across the city. So we have two excellent spokeswomen with us tonight to open up this conversation. I look forward to a very back and forth conversation. We will take a number of questions, as many as we can from the audience. And I'd like to start by asking Sonja Trauss to give us a brief overview of her perspective, and she'll be followed by Robin Hughes.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, for making some time. This is super exciting to be here. So as mentioned in the bio, I started organizing pro-housing renters in 2014, and I'm glad that Dana asked, why now? Because that's actually what I was going to talk about in any case. What happened, right? I was teaching high school math. I was taking home $2,000 a month. I wanted to live in San Francisco, but I was living in West Oakland instead because San Francisco was so expensive, and renting an apartment with 3 other roommates, pretty normal situation for somebody who's 30 years old. And what I saw happening, even though it was so clear that there was a housing shortage, was that people were still opposing new proposed developments. And the decisions that were being made in San Francisco were hurting people in Oakland. So one thing that was novel about what I was doing was going from, living in one city and getting involved in the local politics in the next city. And I think that that's something that's really important. We don't have regional planning for housing yet. It's very exciting that at the state level, the state has been taking an interest in it and trying to promote some statewide, more regional planning. But as long as we don't have regional planning, activists have to pay attention to what's happening in the next town over. So it was there were two things. One, when I would go to these hearings, people would say, you don't even live in this neighborhood, you don't even live in this city, your opinion doesn't matter, it doesn't count. And I knew that that was wrong because the decisions they were making were affecting West Oakland. And they were affecting West Oakland because San Francisco was overflowing. There were way more people that wanted to live in San Francisco than there was housing for. People were being displaced from San Francisco. They were moving to West Oakland. It was making rents increase in West Oakland. I couldn't compete with those new people. And then people were leaving West Oakland to go to East Oakland. East Oakland, I'm sorry, you guys, that this is North California geography. But, displacement isn't something that happens once, right? The one neighborhood's displaced is the next neighborhood's gentrifier. It happens in waves, and it affects chains of people. The other thing that I think nobody has talked about yet, and I look forward in the next few years of realizing that there are pro-housing folks out there. So, once I started going to all of these hearings and people saw that I was doing it, it was so unusual, and I was bringing friends who agreed with me. I started organizing other pro-housing renters. Renters don't normally go to hearings because they get cowed. They go to a neighborhood meeting and people say, I've lived here for 30 years, so my opinion's pretty important. And the renter's like, well, I guess I've only been here for a couple years, and maybe I shouldn't say anything. But I was really, telling people, shaking them by the lapels metaphorically and saying, your opinion does matter. If you have an idea, come up and say it, because if you don't advocate for yourself, no one else is going to do it. And evidently that was a message that was resonant, and also the message that we need more housing was resonant, and it exploded way beyond what I ever imagined. But the thing that we haven't talked about is that in San Francisco, it was possible for a renter to be advocating for more housing as a renter's issue, because in San Francisco, you cannot tear down existing rental housing or affordable housing in order to build new housing. We have demolition controls, and it's illegal. So the nexus between neighborhood character folks, people who just want to oppose all housing for any reason, and people who are renters' rights advocates. These people are naturally allies in places where in order to build new housing, you have to tear down existing housing. But in San Francisco, you cannot do that. And so I think that if I had been in another place, you know what I mean? It wouldn't have seemed so obvious to me that we were ready for the next step. The renters' rights movement over the last 40 years has had a lot of really incredible successes, right? Rent control, just cause, and then the demolition controls that I was just talking about. These are things that keep renters in their home. And once you have that, then what? Once you have price controls, once you have regulations that help you stay in your home, that guarantee you security, that protect you from your place being torn down, what is the next step? And the next step has to be more housing overall. And it could be built by affordable housing nonprofit developers. It could be built by public agencies. It could be built by the market. Personally, I am completely agnostic. The reality is today, if we want to have the shortest distance from this moment to a lot of housing, the market is an institution that's in a position to be able to deliver that housing. But I look forward to nonprofit developers and public housing agencies also becoming strong enough and well-funded enough to make that happen. Anyway, so the only reason that I also realized another thing. This is what I want to talk about. The reason I have slides was because Robin was going to do slides, but then at the last minute she didn't. So now I'm stuck just having slides by myself. But I put together something that I had wanted to put together before anyway, which is pictures that people are making to oppose SB 50. When I first started, I assumed that what was good was, big apartment buildings, 300 units, 500 units, 2,000 units at a time, because it's a lot of housing all at once, and those are great. As time passed, I found out that actually the path to ending our housing shortage overall in California is to allow people to tear down single-family homes and replace them with, in this case, I think this thing is supposed to be like 8 stories. 8 stories is a little expensive to build, but 8 stories, 5 stories, 3 stories, 4 stories, so that our neighborhoods wind up being mixed. Some single-family homes, some apartment buildings. These are images that people are making so that NIMBYs look at them and freak out and get really motivated to come to hearings to oppose SB 50. But this is actually the future that NIMBYs want. This is my favorite one. It is so beautiful, and it is exactly the goal. Because what I discovered is that per square foot, it's expensive to build a 16-foot building, even an 8-story building, even an 8-story building. And a 3-story building is something that's very cheap. And we have a lot of just really, this is like a story and a half right here. So really the cheapest thing is going to be to let people tear down their single-family homes and densify in a gentle way. So I co-founded the California Renters Legal Advocacy and Education Fund, but I did not make up the name. It's very long. And we sue to enforce all of the great state laws that we already have, actually, such as Dana's ADU law. We have an entire staff person who's dedicated to helping people build ADUs. We have a hotline, basically, because a lot of people are like, great, I read in the paper, I can build an ADU. They even maybe look up the law themselves and read it. They go to their planning department, and the planning department says, I don't care. Literally, somebody at a planning department recently said, I don't care what that law says, you can't do that here. So they call us, we enforce the rules. So hopefully I haven't gone over my time. I can't wait to hear from the audience. Great thing about not that many people here is that everybody's question can get answered. All right, so talk to you soon. Thank you.
So imagine beautiful pictures of Abode Communities development on the screen now. Sorry about that. So as mentioned, my name is Robin Hughes, and I'm president of Abode Communities. We are a nonprofit architecture, development, property management firm that's been around for 50 years, addressing a range of housing and community development issues. As I was sitting there listening to the conversation here on stage, I feel like, for now 30 years, I have been battling with the impact of NIMBYism. I've probably attended, 100 or so community meetings and have stood before city council members and could hear people in the back feeling like they were throwing daggers in my back as they talked about the beautiful affordable housing we were proposing to build in their cities. And I would hear things about, yes, density and parking and traffic, but when it ultimately came down to it, it was about the people that were going to live there. And when we came to this point in time, when we were able to begin to dispel this myth about what affordable housing is. It's not slum housing, quite frankly, it's not public housing, but it's well-designed, well-managed housing that is housing the people who basically serve our economy. It's housing people that are the teacher aides in the schools or that are the retail workers in our stores, things like that. And so it was always amazing that this great fear about the unknown. And so this yes being movement is interesting to see this intersection now. And I think here in Los Angeles, it actually came out, at least in my world, when Measure S was on the ballot a few years ago. And it was really great to have folks at the table talking with advocates like Abode Communities about, yes, we want to be there standing with you arm to arm, talking about, yes, we need density. Yes, we need more housing built in our communities. And so it's a welcome movement in our work. It'll be interesting as we have our dialogue. I'm not, I'm that whole concept of density and preservation of community, I feel like we have to do a balance of that, but what does that look like is really important. But this fear of density, this fear of the unknown, has led us to this affordable housing crisis that we're faced with now today. And Dana talked about it a little, but for me, the statistics have real names, real families, real people. Oftentimes we just completed a development in South Los Angeles, 175 apartments, and we got over 2,500 applications for those units. And when I talk with the families as they move in, I don't know why, but I'm always stunned by the housing choices they have had to make in the city. And I often hear about the family with a working mom and dad who were forced to live in a garage that was actually divided into multiple spaces with multiple families living in it because that's all that they could afford. Or these young kids with their parents living in a 2-bedroom apartment and sharing that apartment with 11, 12 other people, just having no privacy, no dignity, no place to be a family, again, because that's all that they can afford. And it's really because we have not been able to produce housing at a level to keep up with the increase in our population, nor have we been able to produce housing that is affordable to the people that are working in our local economy. The fact that to live in a standard 2-bedroom apartment in the county of Los Angeles, we call it the housing wage needs to be $46. So that means that if someone is a minimum wage worker, they would have to work 180 hours in a week in order to afford a standard 2-bedroom apartment. And so what we're seeing is just more and more people are spending more in their income to cover their housing costs, so they have to make other choices about what their family will forgo. So, over the last decade, Abode Community as an organization, we have tried to address the affordable housing and homeless crisis that we're faced with in the region through the production and preservation of affordable housing. And as you heard in my introduction, we have developed over 45 residential communities serving 8,000 residents. And thank you. And we intentionally serve extremely low, and very low income families, seniors on fixed income, and more we're doing what's called permanent supportive housing. And that is taking those resources that are available to us to provide housing for people who are experiencing homelessness, as well as those that are at risk of homelessness, and providing both the housing, the shelter that they need to live in, but also bringing the services to wrap around and support them to remain stable in their home and to thrive. And I believe housing stability and having housing it's beyond that shelter that's needed. It's a place where we see families, kids come into our building and they begin immediately doing better in school. We see seniors who are able to live in their homes longer because they can afford it and they have the services and resources around them to live there. And we see, homeless individuals or people with special needs being able to remain stable in their home, but also have the resources they need to navigate the system. So this really, the safety net that housing and these other resources can provide are really more about housing. Is providing social and economic stability and mobility for the people that we serve. So yes, we're trying to address our housing crisis, but we're also wanting to make sure that those resources are available. So I've completely gone off script, but I'll keep going. I do think that part of what has allowed production to happen more has been the design of our affordable housing, but we also engage with community. And we have found a way to make sure that it's not just the NIMBY voices that are heard, but it's truly the people that are in need of affordable housing. Their voices are heard as well. And then I would say that bringing in high quality property management services has really been critical to our work. But, we still have our challenges, that disparity that we're experiencing between rising rents and stagnant wages creates greater demand for our housing and quite frankly has contributed to the homeless crisis that we're facing. There's just not enough land, and there's not enough land that is appropriately zoned for the production of affordable housing. So the bills like SB 50 and other state legislation that make it easier and quicker and less risky to build affordable housing is definitely what's needed. And our work is about trying to ensure that people who live in certain communities that are experiencing gentrification are not displaced. The development that I spoke about earlier is in South LA across the street from USC. Originally was 140 units, was 48 units, and we developed 140 units. But it's a piece of property that could have been lost to the market and the families completely displaced from the community. We will open the building. Hopefully we'll get our TC vote tomorrow and open the building next month. And of the 36 families that relocated when we were starting construction, 26 of them will return to the development. So that's what our work is about. It's making sure that people who live in the communities as they are changing get to stay in the community and benefit from those things in housing that they can afford. So, I think there are some great opportunities out there that we see, with the passage of financial resources to support the production of affordable housing. You all know about Measure H and Measure HHH that were passed a few years ago to support the production of permanent supportive housing. Last year, we had Propositions 1 and 2 on the state ballot. All of those things are great, but ultimately, what it really comes down to is the siting of housing, and in particular affordable housing. Without the ability to go out and build, we will never be able to address our affordability crisis. And to build, we need density. We need to be able to the number I had earlier in California, we need to build, I think, like 160 million units by 2025 in order to house the wage workers. And in order to do that, we need density, we need to grow. So I too, so again, imagine beautiful pictures up there of houses and people. So I too, I look forward to our conversation. I know Dana has some really great questions for us, but I also look forward to hearing from the audience.
Thank you both. I think that lays out some of the issues for us pretty well. And maybe I'll just pick up from where Robin left off, which might make a number of us here in Los Angeles. Sonja, you don't know this story, but in the H and HHH housing that we now have funding for, with a growing YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement, the homeless housing that was proposed in Venice was very soundly rejected by the neighbors. A very progressive neighborhood that didn't want a homeless shelter in its neighborhood. So I think one question we might ask is, how do we generate a broader base for YIMBYism so that it means that neighborhoods across our cities accept their part of that density and particularly of affordable housing? And maybe, Sonja, I'll ask you to answer first.
Sure. This is why it's good to have two people on the panel, because in your profession, well, you'll tell us, but I think Robin is going to have good ideas about how to talk to people and convince them. My philosophy is drown them out. Just drown them out. Just grab as many people as you can and bring them out. Right now we have a homeless shelter that, God bless her, our mayor proposed in actually one of the richest neighborhoods in our city. And it's in the high-rise, luxury tower neighborhood that a lot of people say all those towers are empty. Well, you can find out if they're empty by proposing a homeless shelter near them. They are not empty. And the people there are so pissed, and it is brutal. So yeah, we just have to bring more people out. Because one of the things, too, about people that are against having a homeless shelter or low-income housing in their neighborhood is, that I've noticed at least, is that they're super indignant and they're sure that literally everyone agrees with them. And so when people come out that don't agree with them, especially people that look like them, it's very disorienting. I went to one of the hearings and I put on my best flowered top and pearl earrings, and I brought my baby, and these other moms were like, yeah, moms, you can't have a homeless shelter near moms because we're raising our kids here. And I was like, I totally disagree with you and I think you're wrong. And it was very destabilizing. So that's my strategy, but maybe it's not the nicest one.
Well, I think I have to agree with you. Bring him out and bring him loud. No, so I can remember when Measure HHH was on the ballot, and I was listening to NPR, and it was election day, and the people on the radio who talked about the need to have these resources to build permanent supportive housing was critical. We have people living on our streets. These are our neighbors. They're already in our community. We need to have these resources in place. And for us in the affordable housing development world, that was really great. It's like all of a sudden we had this increased support from the public around the housing and homeless crisis that we're facing. And then the measures passed and the resources are available, but then immediately as we began to go out and get sites and site affordable housing development or permanent supportive housing or shelter, that's when the yes but not here comes out. And I do think that the only way to counter that is by bringing out more voices that says yes, that it's really okay. We have people already living on our streets. Let's provide the resources they need. And just because the shelter is there doesn't mean all of a sudden you're now going to get people from downtown coming to Venice for services. It's not how they work. It's really amazing when we do the homeless count now and we talk to people and they will literally tell you, I used to be able to rent an apartment over there, but now I can't afford it, so I'm going to stay here in the Arroyo. This is in Highland Park. People who are homeless now, and it's not just the chronically homeless with substance abuse issues and mental health issues, is those that are, I'll call it economically homeless because they just can't afford to live in a home, but they're still in the communities. So it's really serving the people that are already there, whether it's in the shelters and bringing the resources that they need to get by day to day, or it's in the permanent supportive housing where, in addition to the housing, they're going to get all the mental health, economic services, case management that they need to remain stable. So I do think it's bringing more voices out. That's the only way.
Well, that answers part of, I think, a changing landscape of the way our land use regulation has been operating, because the NIMBY opposition to new development has been so forceful. Many local agencies have been unable to actually produce the kind of housing that they may be mandated to produce. And so it's pushed all that legislation up the food chain to the state level, which basically removes the voices that you're saying need to be in the process. I don't know if you think there's kind of governmental levels where you think the housing advocacy needs to operate. I have a feeling Sonja's going to say every level, but I'll wait to find out if that's the case.
I don't. Do you want to go? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I do advocacy at all levels because it does matter from land use standpoint and financial standpoint. But ultimately, development is still very, very local. And getting local political support, political will to make it happen is critical. But I appreciate the streamlining legislation that's coming out of the state level right now, because it does create opportunities for more housing to get produced. But I do have one challenge with it, especially in a city like Los Angeles. So all the streamlining bills assume that the zoning is actually in place to build the housing. And that's not in the case of cities like Los Angeles, which has outdated community plans and zoning. So we need to find a way in which we can more broadly deal with the land use issues around neighborhoods that have completely changed from the time that a community plan was put in place to where we are today, to make those changes easier. I don't know how we streamline general plan amendment to zone change, but somehow we have to go in that direction.
Yeah, that is a super important thing that a lot of people don't appreciate or get confused about. There's three elements. There's zoning, process, and process is what all the streamlining does. Process is how much local control do you have. Zoning is like, oh, you can build an apartment building here. You can build 5 stories and as many apartments as you want, as long as you have 20% of the lot, open space. Okay, in some places, if that's your zoning, you just go right to the Department of Building Inspections with your plans. They make sure that it's safe, and then you get your permit. Not so in most of California. In most of California, even though that's the published zoning, there's still a discretionary community process. So yeah, there's a lot of laws that are coming from Sacramento to try to just make people follow their own zoning, make cities follow their own zoning. And then there's a third thing, which is enforcement. You could have whatever process rules you want, whatever zoning rules you want. At the end of the day, all permits are local. And really, take a step back, laws follow practice. If your state or city or whatever your government passes laws that nobody wants to follow, like they're just not going to. So no matter what, we have to have participation at all the levels. In your own community, you should join your neighborhood group and, make your voice heard. And you should join neighborhood groups in all of the communities that remotely affect you. And I've talked about that before. I'm talking about it again because it is so important. And it's kind of hard to do because people really will try to say, this isn't your neighborhood, your opinion doesn't matter. But especially with something like low-income housing and homeless shelters, which really are public goods, that really support the whole city, you have to go and support them even if they're not in your own neighborhood.
Here in Westwood Village, there was a second alternative to that, which was that the students at UCLA and some of the other renters in the area formed their own neighborhood council to counter the existing neighborhood council. And maybe not just to counter it, but to add their voices so that the whole conversation was much more enriched. And I think it served exactly the purpose you're talking about, which was to give voice to the people other than the people who'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years as homeowners. I think it's not necessarily the case, however, that we've found the kind of civil discourse that we need to find in order to build more housing. And I'm not sure exactly whether you have any suggestions about how we do that. One way is to just push ahead. But on the other hand, it does seem to me like questions of gentrification and densification are ones that need some kind of greater conversation, especially in our cities and neighborhoods where low-density areas in particular aren't accepting new, affordable, dense, or more housing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually pretty pessimistic about the prospect for civil conversation going forward. Because as time passes, if we really build a lot of housing and if we densify our suburbs, that sounds fine. We're like, oh, city planning, densifying the suburbs. I'm, thinking about costs of building per square foot. And that's how I was thinking about it at first. But then I suddenly realized that what we're talking about is economic integration. That if you have a suburb with a bunch of $2 million single-family homes, and this was our first case in Lafayette. Lafayette is a suburb like that. Large lots, 10,000 square foot lots, big homes. And there was a developer that wanted to build 315 apartments. And the neighborhood said, no way. They were freaking out. Because obviously the kind of person that can afford an apartment in that neighborhood would not be able to afford a house. So economic integration is as in a country, we said that we integrated, we thought we integrated, we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. When I was a kid in the 1980s, people talked about the civil rights movement as something that had passed, that we did it, which is crazy. We never did it. And so every ugly thing that happened in the 1960s is actually ahead of us times 10 because we're going to have to do it soon.
So I actually think today is the moment in time for the conversation for two reasons, and maybe multiple. But one is the homeless crisis that we see in cities like LA and the Bay Area, where it's just so visible, and we can no longer sort of drive down the freeway, ignore that person on the side of the road. That it's just in every neighborhood spread out through a lot of communities, which is significant. But it's also impacting a generation of people, and I told the story about my nephew earlier, who just can no longer afford not only to buy a house, that is completely out of reach, but to rent a one-bedroom apartment like I did when I graduated for college. It's like my nephew, my sister could not believe it, was willing to rent a bedroom in someone's apartment, and the person was going to sleep in the living room, and I think he was going to pay like $1,500 for it. But that's, he's 1 year out of college, and that's what so when it's impacting us, at the level it started to, then we have to have the conversation about how to create this density in places that we may not have been willing to do years ago. So
I think the shared burden of affordable housing has made us all, at some level, housing activists, that's for sure. As an architect, I think I would be remiss in not talking a little bit about the quality of the kind of housing that we're building. And Pache, Sonja, I didn't find that so beautiful. And it wasn't just because of the high density, low density, but the fact that there really isn't architectural design that starts to think through what the whole neighborhood's quality of life might be. And maybe this seems too idealistic when we're really trying to produce more housing. But I feel like if we don't consider the quality of housing, we're only going to build more enemies rather than advocates. And I think that Abode really works towards that in the quality of their housing. And I wonder how, in a YIMBY stance, you still have any room to suggest that some kinds of housing might be better than others.
I like brutalism, so don't ask me anything about this. I don't know. I had my own ideas. I used to work for my neighborhood association, and I loved poring over these plans, although actually no one built anything in our neighborhood. they came and proposed it, never happened. Anyway, but when I started this, I said, you know what this process doesn't need is another amateur with an idea about how this thing should look. Like, let's just get it going. And like, once this problem is solved, then we can go back, you know, to thinking about aesthetics. So, you know.
It comes hand in hand. so you quality design is both about how it fits within the context of neighborhood, but it also is about the experience of people that are going to live there. So I think about it from both perspectives. So, you know, I was debating with Jane, it's a design issue, but a land use issue. You know, we want to build or design quality units where people are going to live. We want to build buildings that are going to fit within the context of a neighborhood. You know, I think there is room to preserve low density and still have elegant, graceful, high density too. You know, as I wasn't a city planner, but someone that thinks about how cities plan and how cities grow, there has to be a balance of those things. Just like we don't want an industrial use next to a residential use, we want different types of density. But that density has to happen, and I think in a city like Los Angeles, it has to happen everywhere. It can't be concentrated in one specific area. So how does that work that it is? And you know, all of the legislation that's come down from the state has really been around transit and around creating density around transit, which, you know, I think is important as cities change, as population change. Concentrating density and transit communities is really important. But I do think that there's increased density that can happen in our suburbs too. But design is, back to Dana's point, design is critically important.
Well, maybe while I ask one last question, and I'll read through the questions and sort them, you could talk about, either one of you, whether you think there's any place we shouldn't build housing. I mean, I think I remember asking my free market brother-in-law that question, and he said, nope, if somebody wants to build it on Half Dome, they should do so. Yeah, I don't see him so much anymore. But I think that we would all agree there should be some kinds of boundaries to that. But I wonder where you would draw them.
Does the nature side come out in me? You know, I don't think we should build everywhere. I do think that it is appropriate to build. It's most appropriate to build housing where people need housing, where that might be. So if that's close to job, that's close to resources and things like that. I don't know that we should be building housing on wetlands or, you know, just, you know, taking all over our beach lines, things like that. I think there is some preservation of nature that has to happen. To me, that's probably what it is. So it's not everywhere.
Yeah, fire zones. And this is something that's really relevant right now. I mean, we have huge areas that were burned down, and it's only going to get worse. Flood zones, like in Houston, you know, they ignored the flood maps. They knew they were wrong. Earthquake zones, just kidding. But no, yeah, so there are mudslides, definitely, wetlands. There are places, and that's actually why densification is so important. And I do want to add something, actually. So I've been to a lot of panels, and if anybody here has been to a lot of panels, affordable housing developers always talk about how they have excellent design. And I always was like, I don't know, is that true? Actually, it is true. I ran for supervisor, and I didn't win, but it worked out in other ways. And one of the things about it that was great was that I had the opportunity to knock on thousands of doors, you know, all across my district, which is the high density district, and the nicest places that I was in were affordable housing developments. And what made them so nice was really generous and human public space. The hallways were wider. There were like all these community courtyards. It really was actually the best.
Well, it would be interesting to hear the answer then, Sonja, because a lot of that comes from regulation, which is setting minimum standards, which are actually pretty generous. And it's something that we don't do on the market rate housing, which often means that we're making super small units that are pretty expensive. there are so many interesting questions from the audience. I'm just going to start in, and there's a couple here that have to do with tech workers, and I think that there's a kind of general narrative. The three of us were talking about this earlier, about the influx of tech workers in both San Francisco and Los Angeles, and that's been associated with YIMBY, and thus has made an anti-YIMBY movement out of it. So I think the question that was asked very kindly was, do you think tech jobs are directly affecting housing affordability? So let's hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, the growing economy, means more workers, and workers have higher wages, and a big part of the growing economy is definitely tech. I actually think that the causation is the other way around. So when I started organizing pro-housing renters, a lot of them were in tech. I mean, I wasn't, but that was part of my social network. And as I was broadcasting this message, those were people that were really picking it up. These people are renters. Some of them make a lot of money. Not all of them do. Not everybody in tech has a $100,000 job. There are people making $30,000 or even $60,000 in tech. There are people that come. It's true. You can laugh. Huh? It's just a lot of money. Oh. 30,000 is? I mean, it's minimum wage. There are people that come to San Francisco hoping to make it and, aren't making anything at all because they don't have a job yet. And all of these people are renters. And so, but what the existing renter organized establishment, the message they were broadcasting is that these new tech workers are coming, they're ruining San Francisco, they're pushing people out. And the new tech workers were like, I'm not here to push anybody out. I came here from Kansas City and I want to make my life better. I came here for a job. And I thought it was a huge mistake for the existing tenant organizers to leave all those votes on the table, because all of us are renters. All renters really should get together because we all have a common interest. I was yes on 10. You can look it up. What about them? I was yes on 10. It's easy. The point is that all of us are renters and we're all in this together.
So let
The job of a good organizer is to get people who think they're different but actually have something in common in order to work together to a shared goal.
If I could interrupt for a minute, I think the point that Sonja was making about not civil discussion is actually happening right now. So let's try to walk it back a bit, and let me ask one of the questions from the audience that I think goes to this, which has to do.
Actually, that was my idea. I was in the green room, and I was like, we should have somebody on here. It was too late.
I'm really happy to gather all the opinions and positions from the audience, and I think if I hear you correctly, what we're talking about, or one aspect of what you're talking about, has to do with rent control and income levels, and that we need to address those things, not just housing production. And I think that's a very reasonable point of view. It seems to me, as we focus so much on housing production, we overlook the question of whether there will ever be affordable enough housing if we don't do something about wages and income, and if we don't do something about basic issues of social justice. So I'm not sure if you have anything you'd like to add to that conversation, whether we have to talk about minimum wage or working living wage issues at the same time.
Absolutely. I was in a group discussion around the cause of so many issues that we deal with in low-end community of colors. And it ultimately came down to wages, whether it was housing, whether it was access to childcare, whether it was access to health, whether, all of those things came down to needing to create jobs that pay a living wage, if not better. So in this case, it's the tech workers that are creating more demand for housing, that are causing higher rents, and that are pushing lower income people out of the housing market and quite frankly sometimes into homelessness, it's not the tech workers, it's the way in which our economy works and that great disparity in income between low income wage earners and more affluent wage earners. And I think that is more of the issue. Yes, we have to address the housing production crisis issues, but it's also about income equity as well.
Well, maybe a follow-on question to that is one that's raised in a number of these questions, which is, how is it that we have empty luxury housing downtown and we aren't producing affordable housing? If the market can solve the problem, why is it that more and more developers are building luxury housing so that they actually have vacancy rates, whereas affordable housing is having such a difficult time getting constructed?
That is zoning. Actually, in San Francisco specifically, we have such an ugly history. In the 1970s, there were people tearing down single-family homes, building, 4 stories, apartment buildings. And of course, the neighbors hated them. They said these are instant slums. They downzoned. Then 20 years later, they upzoned the eastern side of the neighborhood. The eastern side of the city. So on balance, right, we have a similar zoned capacity as if we had never done that downzoning. But the upzoning one was in the east side, which was a warehouse district, an SRO district, a district that some people say had fewer people living in it. And I don't even know if that's true. What I do know is that they were people that City Hall didn't care about. And what they upzoned for were 40-story towers. And 40-story towers are like the Ferraris of building. You have to have an expensive elevator forever. Building, you have to have all this concrete and steel. Whereas a 4-story building is, it's like a Toyota. So we literally, this is what's so important about allowing 4 or 5 stories everywhere, is that is a cheap kind of housing. And if you don't allow it, you can't build it. And then, we get all this luxury stuff.
So I think it's zoning, but I also think it's economics, which, and this is my perspective about especially downtown Los Angeles, which was, yes, the zoning and the specific plan allowed for the density that we're seeing built in downtown Los Angeles. But right now, land costs and construction costs are so high that this, 4-story building right now that was mentioned, you can't get the rents to pay to do that. But what you can get the rents for, people perceive, are the luxury apartments. And so somehow the developers of luxury apartments felt like there was enough demand, meaning there are enough people who earned so much money that they could afford these luxury apartments, and that the investors and lenders also believe that. So we saw, parking lots in downtown Los Angeles, in South Park and other places, with all of these luxury apartments. And here, a decade later, when all of the units are now on the market, there just isn't that demand for that high-end luxury housing. So it lays out there vacant. Another part of that is I am also a strong believer of inclusionary housing. Had that housing had some inclusionary component, that at least some of those units would have been satisfied for lower moderate income households. So, yeah.
Is it reasonable to expect that we could up the level of inclusionary housing in market rate housing? And if that's possible, why hasn't that been done? If it can be done, where do we do it?
So it's interesting. So I'm actually going to talk about something that the city has done well, but it came as a result of activism. So when JJJ passed a couple years ago, one of the things that it required was that the city put in place this transit-oriented communities, put in guidelines to increase density along transit. And so probably last year about this time, the city, maybe a year and a half ago, the city actually put in place its TOC ordinance. And it's been an amazing tool to increase the production of housing. That includes affordable housing. But there are enough incentives in there around density, around, be a little techie, around FAR, around height, around all of those things, that there's enough development incentives that, and if your development sits within these incentives, you can basically go over and get a building permit, streamlining, that it is increasing the production of market rate housing that includes affordable housing. So I do think it is a matter of having the right zoning, but having the right development incentives to then tie the inclusion of affordable housing to them. But we also need to bring back redevelopment, but that's a different story.
Yeah, we actually do have a lot of inclusionary, although we call it a density bonus. And in other parts of the country, people know that those are interchangeable. But here we don't realize when we're saying density bonus that we're talking about inclusionary. SB 35 actually, if in effect, instituted 10% inclusionary everywhere in the state and 50% in some parts of the state, you know, if you want to take advantage of that streamlining program. In San Francisco, we did raise the inclusionary from 12% to 25%, and it killed a bunch of projects. So that's the thing about inclusionary, as if it's not a density bonus, if it's not a voluntary program that's tied to, you know, concession, like zoning concessions, I know I don't want to like have too many vocab words, then you run the risk that it'll kill development, and then 25% of zero is zero.
There are a number of questions in this pile, which, again, they're really intelligent questions, which ask really fundamental questions, and I think it's worth our trying to lay them out. One of them says, why is it called a housing crisis when really we have enough houses to actually support people? It's really an equity crisis more than anything. Another, which is related to that, is how can we talk about housing production or gentrification without actually grappling with real estate speculation? Isn't really that at the fundamental level, you know, issue? Now, maybe you'd say it's so fundamental that how do we begin? But I still think we have to deal with that question.
Yeah, the first question, it's both. We actually don't have enough housing to meet the population needs in places like Los Angeles. There just isn't. I mean, and I think that was, and because it's not the right type of housing. So just because the housing is there, it's not affordable to the people that need it. And we talked about that with the luxury housing. But what I was saying is that it's both. And I think part of the challenge about people believing that we need to address the affordable housing crisis is that they do see apartments, they do see buildings, and they presume that there is enough housing here, apartments here, single family homes here to house the population, but there really isn't. And that's why we do have people that are doubling and tripling up. We do have people that are living on the street because we just don't have enough housing. But it is an equity issue as well around income, and that people just can't afford to live in a place like Los Angeles, cannot afford the rents here. So it's both, it's not one or the other.
Well, maybe this goes along with it, which I think the consensus is that housing alone isn't sufficient, though certainly we need to produce more housing of especially certain types, affordable housing in particular, entry-level market rate housing. But there are a number of questions about ways in which the context should also change. And here's a list which must come from a planner that says, like, would changing Proposition 13 or repealing Prop 13 allow more affordable housing? Should rent control, and this is in a number of the questions, should rent control be strengthened? Would that help or hurt the YIMBY movement? And how about parking? Could we reduce more parking restrictions, and would that produce more housing? All excellent questions.
There are a lot of questions.
Yeah. Take one.
Yeah, so we already have zero parking in San Francisco, so you guys can do that anytime you want. The first one, yeah, I definitely think it is actually also, it's a shortage issue. Yeah, crowding, high prices, lines, wait lists, shortage. That's what you get in a shortage. I don't know. So the thing about speculation is I feel like there's nothing really speculative about buying property in California. Like, you know it's gonna go up. So there's no question about it.
I think you didn't hear the second part of her comment, which was it's not speculative because you knew the prices were going to rise. In other words, it wasn't uncertain. That's
Yeah,
what you
there's
mean.
no uncertainty there. No, speculating is when you don't know what's going to happen. Anyway, but I'm kind of being cute. I think that you're asking something about, like, how can we ever have housing justice if housing is part of the market? And that is totally fair. Yes, please bring the revolution about. I've only been doing this since 2014. Socialists have been organized for decades. Make a plan. You know, I talked to some of the protesters outside before I came in. One of the things, you know, now that the election is over and I'm back to work and I'm like, what am I going to start working on? I'm thinking of going back to a project I had before, which was lobbying the MTA, which runs our buses in San Francisco, to make them build rent-controlled middle-income housing on all of the surface parking lots that they own. They've already done pro formas about it. They've shown that under, you know, some of the parking lots are feasible for nice-sized housing developments. Something that's affordable to a median income person, that where rents increase no more than inflation every year forever, would also earn a return for the MTA of 6% a year, which is awesome. But I mean, the point is, if you want public housing, if you want all of the housing to be owned by the government, that's fine. Let's do it. Let's make a plan. Let's have a part of the government that we focus on. Let's get specific sites. You know, let's do pro formas. Like, get ahead. Listen, Article 34 repeal was introduced by Scott Wiener, so that's no problem.
Back to the questions, or are we out to the audience now? Well, I think the tenants' rights question is something, but both tenants' rights and the maintenance of affordability are questions that come up, I think, as we talk about production of housing as another mechanism by which we're sure that the right kind of housing stays the right kind of housing. Do you see any model instances in our city or elsewhere where tenants' rights have had real effective results?
That's a really good question.
I mean, in San Francisco, when I was running, I told people all over that rent control is the most amazing economic integration program I've ever seen in my life. So, well, one thing is, as I was walking around, I mean, I was knocking on doors, and the range and types of people that were living right next to each other was incredible. So it was a real recommendation for rent control. I think San Francisco is a success. Another thing, a few years ago, I was going on HUD website looking for the most unaffordable city, and I had an idea in my head that I thought that the percentage of people paying more than 30% of their income in rent, you know, if a city had a high percentage of people who were paying more than 30% of their income in rent, then that would be an unaffordable city, you know. And so I sort of expected San Francisco, because it feels so unaffordable, to have this incredible proportion of people paying more than 30% of their income in rent. Totally wrong, actually. In the list of 20 big cities I looked up, it was among the lowest. And I think it's two reasons. One, rent control. Two, people have high incomes. The cities that were the most unaffordable in that measure are places like Baltimore, where people are low income. So lesson learned, it's not the measure that you're looking for, chances are, but it is also a testament to how effective rent control is. Look, Prop 10 wouldn't have really given anyone rent control.
Maybe we can take this up.
I mean, why wasn't Prop 10 just statewide rent control? Yeah, definitely. That would be the best.
Thank you. Thank you. Especially since we're actually addressing questions from the broader audience. There's one that I think addresses the question you raised, Robin, in your conversation about how complicated it is to find sites for affordable housing. That's actually one of the most problematic aspects of providing housing today. And really the ADU law that we wrote was about finding a site that people didn't think of as a site, your backyard, which could actually be almost like free land. And at my center, we're now working on school sites, especially the surface parking there as another site for potential affordable housing. But here's someone who says, what about all this area taken up by roads? And I'll slip in parking on that. Couldn't there be a way in which we could think about the land in Los Angeles differently and actually enable some kind of housing sites that might not otherwise exist?
On our streets?
I think, yes.
Get rid of our cars and
reducing the area taken up by cars. I don't think they're ready quite for removing cars altogether, though we did propose that for Westwood Village.
No, but I do think this concept of taking underutilized public lands like parking lots is a great way of addressing housing affordability and making it affordable to the production of affordable housing. So Dana mentioned working with school districts to do that. So we've now developed 2 projects with LA Unified School District where we took their underutilized land and developed affordable housing. The first one is in Glassell Park, and it was a parking lot that was used by their teachers, and so we built the parking back, but we also built an early ed center and 60 units, 60 apartments for families. The second project is in Hollywood. So again, a parking lot, but in this case, it was actually revenue generating for the local elementary school because they would rent it out at night and on the weekend to the local entertainment district. And so with a ground lease, the district provided that property to us, and we rebuilt the parking so that the school could continue to generate revenue to support the programs there. And we built 77 apartments, and we provide a preference. 50% of those are available to LAUSD employees. So it may not be the teachers, but it's the teacher aides, the folks that are working in the cafeteria, working on the school ground, and they had to work within a quarter or half mile of the site. So creating that work balance too. But it was a way of taking this underutilized land and actually producing housing. So if all government-owned land, there was a priority given to the production of affordable housing and or market housing that had some inclusionary affordable housing if they're going to pay the market rent, then that is an excellent way. So they're not vacant parking lots sitting out there; they're actually being used for the production of housing.
I think there's another set of issues that are really at the foundation of the housing crisis, which is the high cost of construction. And if we can't produce a housing unit, especially in the affordable market, for less than $600,000 here in LA, and people say $750,000 in San Francisco, how are we ever going to make housing other than high-end housing? And I think that's a question that is a kind of Gordian knot, but on the other hand, do you think there are mechanisms to reduce the cost of housing construction? One might be the free land that the city owns that would at least take that cost out of the equation.
There are a few things. I mean, there are people working on modular housing, so that's cheaper, that's exciting, better technology. I mean, more public subsidy. This is the thing about adding housing. I sort of talked about this before. It adds population, and population are taxpayers. So, if you have more taxpayers, you have more tax revenue, and then you can spend more money, and suddenly that, $600,000 per unit, it's like, well, you have more taxes. You can pay for it.
Well, okay, so I'm going to have to disagree with you a little, which is we often find that people who live in our affordable housing basically live in the same census tract, that they were living in substandard or overcrowded conditions and or living on the street. And so but we do create more disposable income to support the economy. So construction costs are completely gone crazy over the last couple of years. And I've actually become more and more concerned that even with additional public subsidy, our affordable housing becomes economically infeasible. So we definitely need to find ways to ensure that they are affordable. So the manufactured housing is something that we're looking at. You will have to go to places of, smaller units. We may not always be able to build those lovely courtyards that you love so much, but we have to think creatively about how we continue to provide good quality housing that is less expensive. But there is land speculation out there that impacts the cost of our housing. When we're paying $1 million an acre for a piece of property in South Los Angeles or East LA, that's because of land speculation, because people now believe that that's what their land is valued at and that's what they're going to sell it at. But the labor shortage, the fact that we don't have enough skilled workers working in our industry, has caused a significant impact in the increase in labor costs. So we definitely, I'm embarrassed to say that we are at $500,000, $600,000 a unit to build housing, but it's not just affordable housing. Market rate developers are faced with that as well.
As we're nearing 9 o'clock, I want to ask a question of both of you that it's been asked on a number of cards, which is how can people get more involved? How do they find out about Abode Housing? How do they join a YIMBY group? How do they become part of a conversation?
You can join both.
How do they join YIMBY, which I think we can definitely help you towards that, which is great. So how can people get more involved?
Yeah, I would definitely invite all of you to come and experience our housing, because you will find that it is the best housing on the block. And from that experience and learning more about us and our work, then at those cocktail parties, at those casual engagements, you have firsthand experience to talk about who lives in affordable housing, how is it managed, how is it maintained, and that those informal conversations that we have around our dinner tables make a big difference in the world. But being able to say firsthand, I've experienced this, I've seen this, I think is really critical. But it is joining the voices. It's joining, whether it's a tenant organization. There's abundant housing here in LA and other places. But joining those types of groups are really important. But it's also showing up at city council meetings or planning commission meetings when affordable housing is being proposed or dense housing is being proposed, and voicing your support. I was on the planning commission in LA for 4 years, and the number of people opposed to the housing, they're going to come out. But those who are in support, that really think we need to build more housing, we're often too busy working and we don't come out. So, just coming out and being engaged, I think is really, really critical. So becoming part of the, yes movement, yes, let's build more housing, I think is really critical. So we do tours all the time. Come visit with us. But I think it's just join. Oh, the other one is neighborhood councils. Neighborhood councils can be that gatekeeper for development any and everywhere. And I was stunned after 10 years when I was invited to neighborhood council in the Fairfax area to talk about affordable housing and putting affordable housing in their neighborhood. And just having those conversations at the neighborhood council level, helping to inform members of neighborhood councils about affordable housing and density, I think will go a long way. So if that's where you choose to join, be that voice, that positive voice for housing production.
Yeah, pay attention to flyers. I mean, one of the other reasons that people don't come out that are pro-housing is that a lot of the materials, the flyers, say, there's a proposal, come out to oppose it. And so if you think it's fine, you're like, oh, this flyer is not for me, and you throw it away. But come out. There was a really great time once in Oakland. They proposed like a 20-story apartment building next to a BART stop, and a woman flyered the whole neighborhood, but there was already a pro-housing kind of email group. And so everybody was getting door knocks and flyers from this woman who was trying to bring people out to oppose it. And we were chatting on the group, and they were like, well, I don't know. Actually, I think this is a good thing. And everybody was like, well, okay, maybe we should go. And then we went to the hearing, and there were so many people that were for the project. And the woman who had flyered, she's like, I don't know who turned all these people out. This is AstroTurf. Somebody must have paid an organizer, but it was actually her. So yeah, pay attention to all the messaging, get on all of the mailing lists, the city mailing lists, go to the hearings, and then YIMBYaction.org is, our San Francisco org, but join it. It's a great mailing list. Abundant Housing LA is the local one. Anything that's like Cities for Everyone or City Name Forward or Abundant is probably some kind of a YIMBY group. And also, join a tenant group also. Like, these things are not in conflict.
Well, I think that's a good way to conclude. I do feel like we should be issuing a call for action. And I think the most important thing is that those of us in the housing activist movement not divide within ourselves, but find ways that we promote housing for everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you both very much for your wonderful comments. Thanks.